Good evening. Welcome to this third webinar of 4 October webinars constituting the online symposium, Global Cultural Environmental Justice, Transdisciplinary and Transcultural Perspectives. This online symposium has been organized collaboratively by UF's Imagining Climate Change Initiative, directed by Terry Harpold, Professor of English here at the University of Florida, and UF's Sustainable Online Network for Global Cultural Studies, or the SONGS initiative, of which I am the director, and my name is Will Hasty. I'm in the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures in German Studies and in the Center for Medieval and Early Modern Studies. The ICC SONGS collaboration grows out of a shared purpose that you'll be able to appreciate by perusing the respective websites. The Imagining Climate Change Initiative has been offering lectures, film screenings, symposia, and other kinds of discussions and events over the past half-decade or so that have engaged artists, humanists, scientists, educators, students, and the public in the vital work of imagining our collective climate futures. The activities of the Imagining Climate Change Initiative range from readings and discussions with artists and scholars in different disciplines around the world to other kinds of events and activities, such as, and this is my favorite one, the effort involved in gathering together with students to plant trees in the Gainesville area. If you Google ICC, you will see that it already has more events scheduled before year's end, and I encourage you to have a look at these. The SONGS initiative officially began in 2017 based on some previous events going back ultimately to a UF commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall that took place on the UF campus in 2009. The goal of the SONGS initiative is the actual construction of a sustainable, which is to say self-sustaining online network for global cultural studies. Speaking as the SONGS director, I'm not sure exactly how the building of this network in all its parts is going to work. But I am sure that it will, as in the case of ICC, involve collaborations among artists, humanists, scientists, educators, and students, as well as architects, engineers, and the public. And I am sure it will also involve continuing discussions such as the kind we have been fortunate enough to have in the framework of the present symposium. At this point, I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Embassy of the Federal Republic of Germany for its support, which has made it possible for us to arrange a poetry slam event as part of this symposium, running alongside the more academic part in which we are presently involved. While I'm on this topic, I want to mention that the deadline for submissions to the Poetry Slam has actually been extended until tomorrow night at midnight. So if you have any ideas, or if you are perhaps inspired by something you will hear discussed tonight, or perhaps have heard discussed in one or the other of the past two events, we'd be very happy to receive a poetic submission from you by the end of the day tomorrow. You'll quickly locate the detailed Poetry Slam information on the ICC or SONGS website, or you can contact me directly. I will mention already at this point, and once again at the end, that we have the fourth and final webinar of our symposium this Thursday, which means the day after tomorrow, with anthropologist Francis Roberts Gregory. Before I set the stage for our guest speakers, a few words about the mechanics of tonight's webinar. Our principal speaker and his respondent will talk for about an hour or so in total, and this will be followed by an open question and answer portion of the evening, giving you the opportunity to address them directly and extend our conversations. Zoom has a built-in built-in question and answer feature. It's the little Q&A button near the bottom of the application window. Feel free to post questions for the speakers at any time during the webinar. I'll be keeping track of them and will queue them up for both speakers at the end. I may sometimes group several questions on related themes into a single inquiry to the speakers. You may post your questions using your name or anonymously. Your preference in this regard will be respected. Other attendees cannot see your questions. Now, to set the stage for tonight's speaker, I'd like to say just a few words about the symposium concept and our previous two speakers. Global Cultural Environmental Justice, as the main heading of the symposium, for me, comes from the strong sense of the urgent need to act purposefully and jointly on a global scale in order to address challenges and problems that are presenting themselves to us on these same global dimensions. On the other hand, I would see the preposition trans, which has been twice incorporated into the symposium's subtitle in the terms transdisciplinary and transcultural, as going in the direction of a much more individualized dynamics that underscores the crucial importance that I believe will have to be given in any global approach to each and every individual academic disciplinary perspective, as well as to each and every particular regional cultural point of view that might productively be brought to bear to address the global challenges we have to face. It's this need to move across or trans, to interconnect disciplines and cultures differently, to mobilize them for joint global efforts, as well as the need for each and every different individual disciplinary and cultural perspective to be involved and respected in its distinctness, that I imagine being expressed by the prepositional prefix trans as used in the subtitle of this symposium. In the first webinar, Chinese pre-modern historian Dorothy Ko showed the importance of pre-modern rituals of siting, among other things involving feng shui, for the religious, philosophical, material blueprints, perhaps we could call them, underlying the landscape architectural projects of Kongjianyu in Beijing, Shanghai, and numerous other places within and beyond China. In the views of Dorothy Ko regarding Yu's work, and with additional considerations contributed by respondent Anna Peterson of UF's Department of Religion, progress intriguingly showed itself as a sort of very individual creative reversing of temporalities, a manner of building landscapes according to century-long, time-honored traditions that continue to work today and lends themselves by extension to new creative uses. In the second webinar of this symposium, Andrea Zuri, with additional considerations added by her respondent, Simone Atayad, provided some perspectives on what is presently happening in the river deltas of her homeland, Brazil, where global efforts to develop in more sustainable ways via the construction of hydroelectric dams have morphed into what looks very much like an Occidental colonialism done over in green, the goal of which is the dispossession, relocation, impoverishment, if not complete elimination of the indigenous populations who have lived along these rivers for generations. The previous two speakers took us in these very different, fascinating, and sometimes quite troubling individual directions, spanning temporalities, cultures, academic disciplines. As we move forward now to tonight's speaker, we are afforded, I think, the rare opportunity of engaging one of the most significant, consequential, and truly global approaches to addressing questions and issues pertaining to global cultural environmental justice. All of this happening in the area of practical economic and political policy making. Many, if not most of us, might regard the words Green New Deal as a somewhat controversial term connected to political and economic developments in this country over the past few years. But the origins of the so-called Green New Deal actually go back at least as far as the time of the Great Recession, around the years 2008, 2009. Nobody, it seems, is more closely connected with the economic thinking behind what has come to be known as the global Green New Deal than our guest speaker tonight, Professor Edward B. Barbier. Edward Barbier is University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Economics at Colorado State University and a senior scholar in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. His main expertise is natural resource and development economics, as well as the interface between economics and ecology. His recent work focuses on policies for greening the post-pandemic recovery, which is summarized in his World Economic Forum blog post titled, "Here's How to Deliver a Green Recovery for the G20 Economies." Professor Barbier has authored numerous books. Most notable for me because of the title is A Global Green New Deal, Rethinking the Economic Recovery, which was published in 2012 by Cambridge University Press. And this book, I believe, Dr. Barbier can correct me, but I believe this goes back to a 2009 report that he made to the United Nations Environmental Program. Professor Barbier has been kind enough to share with me numerous recent articles of his that have appeared recently, along with his permission to share those with the public via the SONGS website and the ICC website. So you'll find all of these writings linked there soon. Professor Barbier's talk tonight will be drawing on lessons learned from the challenging times connected to the Great Recession and applying them to the, here we are again, challenging times in which we find ourselves now, again. His central concerns are the responsibilities of citizenship and opportunities for leadership in a world of rapid technological, social, and ecological change. He's published 9 books. That was the most recent count that I was able to find, with a truly impressive breadth of critical concerns. I mentioned here only the 2 of these I saw that patently involved sustainability and climate concerns. The first is the fairly recent book called Sustainability, published by Polity Press in 2016, and Environmentalism for a New Millennium, published by Oxford University Press in 1919. Professors Barbier and Thiel, again, I'm very grateful for your willingness to be involved in this symposium and for sharing your perspectives with UF faculty and students. And with this, I turn things over to you, Professor Barbier.
Thanks very much, Professor Hastie. It's a great pleasure to be here. And thanks for that wonderful introduction. As Professor Hastie said, the Green New Deal is a very controversial politically and economically concept. But one thing that can't be denied is how popular it is. Polls before the pandemic suggest that the Green New Deal among Americans has a higher approval rating than a wealth tax, a semi-automatic assault gun ban, and quite amazingly, free college tuition. It has the same approval rating as legalizing marijuana. And its popularity transcends, that trans word again, all types of demographics, rich, poor, racial demographics, gender, and also urban and rural. And one reason why the concept of Green New Deal is so popular is, of course, it's captured the imagination of our young people in America. The social movement that is behind the Green New Deal is generally one of the next generation. And of course, there's also a very popular spokesperson for that, which is the newly elected representative from New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who has made the Green New Deal one of her landmark pieces of legislation. And the Green New Deal is popular among the next generation because it is about building a better future. As Naomi Klein pointed out immediately after the Green New Deal came out, it's a game-changing promise. Unlike most environmental and economic policies, it's not training a water gun on a blazing fire, but it's actually talking about transforming society and, of course, our economy. I think another reason why the Green New Deal is so popular is because of its environmental justice aspect. And that, I think, is a good reason why we are talking about it in this symposium. Evidence suggests that it's the world's rich that is responsible for most of the climate change emissions, CO2 emissions, compared to the poorest people in the world. And on the other side, unfortunately, as the 2018 fourth national climate assessment in this country showed, the people who are most at risk from climate change and other environmental hazards are the poor in the United States. So for these reasons, intergenerational equity as well as intragenerational equity, the Green New Deal is incredibly popular. I certainly have been thinking about this interchange between wealth and environmental scarcity for some time. And in one of my previous books that was published in 2019, I focused particularly on this interface between what's gone wrong in our economies that have led to greater environmental scarcity on the one hand and growing wealth inequality on the other, and what do we need to transform our economy in order to reduce inequality as well as environmental scarcity. And for me, my conclusion is that it's green transformation, it's long-term change, moving to a greener economy from the fundamentally brown one is the key to this kind of transformation. And so the type of question that I posed in this book, I think is relevant for right now. As again, Professor Hastie pointed out, we are at a crucial crossroads. And we're at a crossroads where we have some green sectors in our economy. But the question really is, will green sectors remain just a small niche within an overall brown economy? Or will the green sectors become the fostering of a new wave of sustainable industrial innovation, research and development, employment that will ultimately replace the brown economy. And I think this question is fundamental for us to think about the Green New Deal, and particularly thinking about the role of a Green New Deal and a transition to a green economy in a post-COVID world. So please keep this question in mind as we move on talking about this topic. So let's just be clear where we are right now in our economy. So right now in our economy, there are some green sectors, and there's energy from renewable resources, or clean energy as it's sometimes called. There's energy efficiency, which has become a booming industry. There's pollution abatement and recycling, cleaning up the mess that our brown economy is making. Conserving and restoring ecosystems is the fourth sector. And finally, there's environmental education, which is becoming a boom sector as particularly we think about the future. So right now we have these 5 green sectors, but they're sort of nested as a small niche within an overall brown economy. And we're at a critical time in our economic development where we have to think, which way will the economy go? Will these green sectors expand but stay within a fundamentally brown economy? Or will we actually transition to moving from a green economy to one that's essentially green? So in the time I have with you today, I would like to do a few things. First, as Professor Hastie said, there are some interesting origins to the concept of the Green New Deal, and I want to start off by talking about those origins. I then want to bring up, during the Great Recession, the strategy of the global Green New Deal. Then, in addition, talk a little bit about what happened during the Great Recession in terms of green stimulus and what its impact was on our economies. And then I want to talk about the period between the ending of the Great Recession and the current pandemic period, which actually is what I call a green policy void, for reasons I will explain in a few minutes. And then finally, I want to talk again about the revival of the Green New Deal before the pandemic, and then finally make the point, how do we make a post-COVID Green New Deal work if we would like to have it work? Okay, so let's talk a little about the origins. Now, some of you may know this. In this country, the person who really probably first promoted the concept of the Green New Deal was the New York Times journalist, Tom Friedman. And in fact, in an article he wrote, an op-ed for the New York Times in January 2007, he called for a Green New Deal. And the story goes, I've heard him interviewed on this, is that the reason he came up with proposing a Green New Deal is that he was sitting in his garden in Washington, D.C., which is where he lives, and it's January, and he's watching daffodils start to bloom. And he says, this is not normal. I mean, I grew up in the DC area and I have family there. I go back. January is not associated with daffodils in Washington, DC. So Tom Friedman basically said, this is a sign of climate change. And he sat down and wrote this article calling for a Green New Deal, which is why he calls it a warning from our garden, to say that climate change is real and we need to do something about it. And we need to do something sustained in order to make this transition to a green economy. But of course, with many journalists, he's not the originator of this idea. It's actually, from my own research, I think probably we can thank the European Green parties for coming up with the original concept. As far as I can tell, the first time the Green New Deal was put together, a coalition of European Green parties put together a Green New Deal task force in 2006. The US Green Party during the recession actually adopted this concept in 2010, and in Jill Stein's 2016 presidential platform, it was also mentioned. So it spread from European green movements to the US green movement. During the Great Recession, the UK Green Party put together their own global Green New Deal group, and they put together the first manifesto calling for policies that would see the Green New Deal as a way of doing a sustained and sustainable recovery from the Great Recession. And then finally, the UN Environment Program picked up the idea of a Green New Deal, and they decided, well, we should put together a global strategy for greening the world economic recovery. And they asked me to, who I had written a lot on green economies up to that time, they asked me, well, Ed, you've done some work on this. Could you put together the strategy for us? And the strategy we put together was based on a comprehensive review of national green stimulus plans, and then examining how we could take those plans, turn them into longer term investments for greening economies. And that was originally released in 2009 and eventually published in 2010 by Cambridge University Press. I'll quickly go through what was in the Green New Deal. Basically, what I did was I said we should think about two types of economies. There are the 20 major large economies of the world, which are responsible for much of our economic output, much of our carbon emissions as well, and much of our population. And these economies are sort of the engine of the world economy. They should invest at least 1% of their GDP over several years, 5 years or more, to reduce carbon dependencies. Meanwhile, there are low and middle income or developing economies. They should also reduce their reduce their carbon dependency, but at the same time, they have other needs such as chronic problems of poverty and infant mortality and energy poverty. So they should be investing in improving clean water and sanitation, developing safety net programs, health and education services, and improving the sustainability of their primary production sectors, which are based on natural resources and land. And then all economies should get rid of perverse subsidies that and other distortions in energy, water, transport, agriculture that are harmful to the environment. We should adopt complementary environmental pricing policies and reforms. We should have international environmental agreements. At this time, there was no Paris Agreement, of course, and we should expand international aid and technical assistance from rich countries to poor to help them in this green transition. That was the global Green New Deal. Now, there was good news and bad news at this time. The good news was that some green policies were implemented during the Great Recession. In fact, a unique feature of the policy response globally to the Great Recession was that governments for the first time adopted wholesale green policies as part of their economic recovery packages. So for example, of the $3+ trillion dollars spent worldwide during the Great Recession on short-term fiscal stimulus to jumpstart economies, about 16%, about 500 billion, was devoted to green expenditures and tax breaks for low carbon energy, energy efficiency, pollution abatement, and materials recycling. And that collective green expenditures tax break is now known as green stimulus. These are wide-ranging policies. They varied from country to country, but generally there was support for renewables. There was some investments and in research into carbon capture and sequestration, energy efficiency, public transportation, light rail networks, enhancing grid transmission, and environmental protection. Almost all this green stimulus was by those 20 major economies, the G20. And in fact, 5 economies, China, US, South Korea, Japan, and the European Union accounted for nearly 90% of it. And globally, all this green spending amounted to just under 1%, 0.7% of world GDP. So it was substantial, but not overwhelming. This is just a slide that shows you more or less the allocation. You can see that out of the global total, by far the largest green stimulus was spent by China, but the United States was not far behind with just over 100 billion. And then South Korea, Japan, European Union. One of the interesting features of the green stimulus is that it had two objectives. One objective was, of course, to jumpstart some green sector initiatives, but the other was to, of course, create jobs and support sectors that were hard hit by the Great Recession, and that included construction and building enterprises and small businesses. So many countries spent a large share of their green stimulus on energy efficiency. Out of the global total, almost 2/3 was on energy efficiency. In the United States, it was about half. So basically, my conclusion from looking at what happened with the Great Recession and the green stimulus, like I said, was good news. First time we've used green policy and green investments in a big way to try and instigate a recovery. But the recovery we had was far from green, nor was it global. And it certainly fell short of what we envisioned as a global Green New Deal in the way that I described those policies. In particular, as I said, almost all the 2/3 of the green stimulus was for energy efficiency. More importantly, some major market distortions, such as fossil fuel subsidies, the lack of effective environmental pricing policies and regulation, they basically prevented the widespread green investments in jobs that you would expect from a sustained green transition. And there was very little support for low carbon or clean energy research and development. There was some support, but not widespread. There was little assistance to help developing countries make the transition or make similar structural changes. There was very little leadership role in climate change negotiations. Yes, eventually in 2015, we got the famous Paris Climate Agreement, but many of you may remember that in 2010, there was the Copenhagen climate talks, which were a wholesale failure, and the inability of the United States and China to lead for that agreement was a major fact. So we never got the international agreement on climate change until 2015, well after the Great Recession period. And essentially, while during the Great Recession there was a lot of momentum and support for the concept of the global Green New Deal, by the end of the recession, when it was over, it was, okay, we're out of hot water. The economy has recovered. We don't need a global Green New Deal. So what was the effect of all these green policies? Well, energy efficiency, I don't want to knock energy efficiency. It's really important, and it's important in terms of reducing energy use in an economy. But let's be clear, it's a one-time investment to reduce energy use, and it has its main impact in terms of very positive short-term impacts on boosting economic sectors like construction and creating short-term jobs, which it does. It is not what you would say the most important policy to have economy-wide sustained green innovations and development. That's not what energy efficiency investments do. And in particular, something I'm going to talk about in a few minutes is that what failed to happen during the Great Recession was we left alone two major market incentives that impede green structural transformation. The first is the underpricing of fossil fuels and other environmental damaging activities. And secondly, as I've mentioned, there was insufficient public support for green innovation and insufficient public investment, government investment in very critical key infrastructure investments that are necessary to complement private investment for green transformation. And without overcoming these market disincentives, you're not going to have green transformation. Okay, I want to dig a little more deep into what happened with the green stimulus to give you some idea of the good things and the bad things. So basically, as I mentioned before, over the Great Recession period, the U.S. spent nearly 120 billion on green stimulus, about 1% of its GDP in total. Half of this went to energy efficiency, and the aim was to reduce energy use, but at the same time boost the recovery and generate employment. It did have an important boost to some growth of renewable energy. There was this uptake in renewable energy thanks to some of the expenditures that were not energy efficiency, that were towards clean energy stimulus in the package of expenditures, but it was a small boost. And while that boost did help to reduce CO2 emissions up to about 2015-16, the more significant impact on US carbon emissions has really come from the slowdown in the economy, the slowness of the recovery and the slowdown of the economy, and of course the switching from coal to natural gas. That's probably had as much of an impact, the switching from coal for electricity generation to natural gas powered stations, as the growth of renewables. So what that means is that what we've not seen is a massive decarbonization of the US economy. Since 2016, our emissions of CO2 have not fallen much, and in fact, in the last couple of years up to the pandemic, they've actually grown quite significantly. What's more important is that the effects of the green stimulus, what it had on the clean energy sectors and others, it pretty much started to peter out soon after the end of the recession. And the reason was because there was no complementary reform of the underpricing of fossil fuels, such as through pricing carbon. In fact, some of you may know this, but it's probably now consigned to history. At the time, the plan was to have green stimulus followed by a complementary carbon cap and trade program for the United States, which would have helped increase substantially renewable energy investment even after the short-term stimulus had expired. But of course, that became politically unfeasible and it never happened. Okay. So then the period between the end of the Great Recession in 2010 to the current pandemic, this is the period I call the green policy void. And the main reason why is that there was really no major green policy initiative during this period. Most of the impacts of the 2008-9 green stimulus was effectively over. Most of the economic impacts pretty much subsided by 2011-12. There's been no clear signs of a significant green structural transformation in the US. And if anything, we started to see carbon emissions rise in the US again. And the reason is, of course, those major market disincentives persist in the US economy. They include environmentally harmful subsidies, the absence of pollution taxes and other market-based incentives like carbon taxes, and of course, lack of public investments to support green R&D. What we have seen is the growth of some environmentally motivated subsidies. So in a sense, rather than deal with the market distortions and the lack of correction of bad policies that support our continual use of fossil fuels, we've turned around and said, okay, we're going to promote green sectors by some subsidies. But these subsidies are important, but essentially we're basically fighting a losing game here. We're trying to make up for huge distortions by putting in tiny subsidies into green sectors. Hence, we have that pattern I showed you before. We have small green sectors that are growing somewhat, but they still remain niche sectors within an overall brown economy. I want to spend a little time talking about the underpricing of fossil fuels, because I think this is important for understanding why it's such a major disincentive. meaning we economists who study this, believe that fossil fuels are grossly underpriced because, and it's quite substantial, because the costs of climate change, local pollution, traffic congestion, accidents, and road damage that occur as a result of our overuse of fossil fuels, that's not included in the price of using fossil fuels. So all of these costs are imposed on the rest of society and are not something that people who use fossil fuels, which all of us do every day, we're not paying for those costs, yet we are paying for them as society as a whole. And some economists, these are not radical economists, these are economists at the International Monetary Fund, which is not exactly a radical organization. These economists have actually estimated globally what are the costs of fossil fuel subsidies and these overall environmental damages that come from the underpricing of fossil fuels. And they've come to the conclusion that in 2015, the underpricing of fossil fuels has cost the world $5.3 trillion, or about 6.5% of the world's GDP. That's a pretty large number. That right there, 5.3 is about just under a third of the entire GDP of the United States. And of course, it's not just fossil fuels. There are other sectors that have massive environmental damages, which are not taken into account in the price of the products. That includes in agriculture, water supply, the use of natural resources, and transport. And as economists, what many of us have been arguing is that if we have this massive underpricing with damages, the most efficient way of handling it is, first of all, remove the environmentally harmful subsidies, and second, impose environmental taxes and other market-based incentives to internalize these damages, the remaining damages, so that we have a fair price for the costs of using these various harmful goods and services. And the reason we say that is underpricing of fossil fuels is a major market disincentive. And in fact, I would argue it's the most significant deterrent to any green structural transformation innovation. And the reason is simple. That means that as long as underpricing persists, we do not have a level playing field between what it costs us to use fossil fuels and to develop them and invest in them, and what it is we have to do to develop, invest, and pay for clean energy. Clean energy is always going to be a disadvantage because it's cheaper to use and invest in fossil fuels. It's clear that underpricing is particularly significant in these major G20 economies. In 2015, $3 trillion annually in 16 of these economies was due to underpricing, and that's about 70% of that global figure I showed you earlier. And we can see here the two main culprits are China and the United States. In the United States, about $650 billion is being borne by our citizens due to the underpricing of fossil fuels. The second major market disincentive is the lack of public support for private green R&D. This underinvestment in research and development is a serious obstacle to the development of the green economy. So let me explain it this way. If you're a private investor and you want to invest in research and development to develop a new product or process, when you do that, you will develop this new product or process, and you could reap the benefits from marketing your product or even licensing out your process. But the problem is that your rivals can easily copy and reverse engineer it. And then they will benefit from the same thing, from the new product and process, by selling that without having to spend all that money in developing initially the product or process through research and development. So you don't capture all the benefits, yet the benefits are huge to the entire economy because everybody starts to develop this new product or process. If you don't believe me, look in your pocket and see this thing. 15 years ago, this did not exist. Now we all have it. And that's the result of private R&D supported by public R&D into a lot of technology, spilling over to a number of other rivals who then have marketed rival phones and voila, we have now the cell phone, smartphone, sorry, revolution. So the upshot is that a single private investor will bear the full cost of financing R&D, but receives only some of the returns and not the full returns of spreading these innovations through the economy. We want these innovations to spread through the economy, but as a private investor, you're not going to capture them. So you're going to say, well, I can't spend that much money. So we, as an economy, underinvest. So government needs to support it. And as the Harvard economist said, these type of market disincentives for investing in innovation exist for all types of technology, but they are particularly relevant for green technologies because they are highly novel, they're experimental, and there's an incredible substantial risk involved for pioneering them. So that explains why we have a tendency to have too little green innovation, is because we're not supporting private investment with public policies. So what do we need? Well, as I've already said, on the left-hand side of this column, we certainly need to deal with the underpricing of fossil fuels and other environmental bads in our economy. But we also have to think of a second set of policies, which are technology push policies to develop the new set of innovations we want in our economy. And that's subsidies to research and development in clean energies and technologies, public sector research and development to complement private sector development of clean energy technologies, and so forth, government finance competitions, strengthen patent rules, and many others. We also have to invest in targeted public investments, green infrastructure investments, I call them, that facilitate the adoption of these new technologies and processes. That includes development of smart grids so we can use renewable energy, which is more diffuse than fossil fuel, transport systems that can allow us to develop mass transport and replace cars with public transportation and even bicycles and other forms that are more climate friendly, charging station networks to bring in the revolution of electric vehicles, and of course, designing, implementing, and investing in more sustainable and human scale cities. These are some of the really important long-term investments you need if you want that green transformation to allow the private sector to do its thing. So what's been the status of green innovations? Certainly at the time of the Great Recession, there was an encouraging sign that environmentally related investments or inventions per capita were on the rise. And you can see a little bit of a bump that occurred during the Great Recession, thanks to some of that stimulus and some deliberate policies and investments in public support for green R&D. What you also see is that the US, who we think is one of the biggest inventors of environmental technologies, actually has fallen behind some of our rivals, particularly South Korea, Japan, and Germany. And what is more discouraging is that for all of our economies, we've seen a fall off in green innovations per capita since the Great Recession, again, because of that policy void I talked about. Only in South Korea, perhaps, have you seen a high level of sustained per capita inventions, and they have been pushing green R&D as a public policy measure. What's very interesting is this graph shows on the horizontal axis public support for environmental R&D as a share of total government R&D support, and then on the vertical axis is that environmentally related inventions per capita. The size of the bubble shows you how much is a particular country share of overall environmentally related public R&D in the world. So the United States over here, we have a large share of environmentally related R&D, but we haven't really invested a huge amount relative to our over government R&D. So in other words, we're putting a lot of money, it looks like we're putting a lot of money in relative to the rest of the world, but most of our public support for government R&D support is not going to environmentally related. And as a result, that's why we have a relatively low level of inventions, actual inventions per capita going on. And what's more discouraging is, as I showed you before, only in Japan and South Korea have we seen government support for environmental R&D go up. In the United States, Canada, Australia, and Germany, and the UK, it's been decreasing. It's fallen 20% between 2010 and 2016 in the United States. Okay, that takes me up to 2018-19, and we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green New Deal revival. And along with Senator Ed Markey, AOC, as you may know, in February 2009, actually implemented a joint resolution to Congress calling for a Green New Deal for the United States. And as I pointed out, it's incredibly popular, and it's broken that green policy void that I was talking about. In particular, their resolution is very low on details, very sparse on details, but it does call for massive government spending over the next 10 years without a number put on it, but that calls for it to shift the US economy from polluting industries, embrace green infrastructure, and produce 100% of energy from renewables in 10 years. And the hope is, according to the resolution, again, no numbers attached, is that the Green New Deal will create jobs and boost the economy. Well, how do you pay for it? Robert Hackett, who's an advisor to AOC, basically says we pay for it like we've paid for other massive spending things. We just do it. We just increase our deficit or whatever we need to do to pay for this. But critics have argued that's crazy. If you're going to completely decarbonize the US economy in 10 years, the price tag could be as high as $12.3 trillion. That brings me up to post-COVID situation. Well, actually, we're still in the COVID situation, but I want to talk about how does the Green New Deal now fit with the reality we find ourselves in. Well, as we all know, the economic and human cost of the pandemic is high, particularly in this country. But we also should keep our eye on the fact that the fiscal bill for battling this crisis, both the health cost, human cost, and the economic cost, the bill is huge and it's rising. So McKinsey and Company, the international consulting company, suggests that governments worldwide are likely to face a $10 trillion deficit in 2020 alone, and a cumulative shortfall of up to $30 trillion by 2023, just from dealing with the pandemic. We know already in this country, just before the pandemic, the US budget deficit in 2020 was in January, February was 1 trillion. Right now, just last week, it was announced it's now 3 trillion. So already we've tripled our deficit. And what's worse is that there's been very little space in the current fiscal stimulus that's been implemented, this massive $12 trillion globally. Very little of it has gone towards green ventures, only about 10%. Now, that sounds a lot in absolute terms, but it's not really a whole lot. And it's certainly not the sustained types of Green New Deal funding that we've been talking about. So the question is a Green New Deal affordable? My response is yes, if we are realistic. And I think one of the problems is that we kind of have focused on this going to 100% renewable as a target. And I think we should back off from that. That's, first of all, experts, technology experts that could take us decades, not 10 years to do. And the price tag could be quite expensive if we try to accelerate it. Instead, I think we should focus on 4 objectives. First of all, let's go back to what a Green New Deal is. It's 5 to 10 years of public spending, of sustained public spending. What should it be on? And how can it help us make a transition to an economy less reliant on carbon and that's greener? And of course, the composition of those public investments are critical, and they should be targeted to some very key types of investments that I've already highlighted. How much would the bill be? How much could it cost, say, an initial 5 or 10 year plan? and how do we pay for it? And I think the key thing here is to think about the Green New Deal as a policy that would set in motion a market-based green transformation strategy for the entire economy, not replace it. So it's the set in motion, the transformation that should take place in the economy through private innovation, investment, and expansion. So putting this all together, the lessons learned from this is that if the US is serious about committing to a Green New Deal, then we must commit to substantial public investments over at least 5 to 10 years. I think the price tag is pretty much the same as what I talked about 10 years ago in the global Green New Deal. It should be 5% of GDP for a 5-year deal. That is 1% of GDP per year. And keep in mind, the US spent 1% over the entire green stimulus of 2 or 3 years. So we're talking about a bigger commitment than what happened during the Great Recession. So based on my calculations, that's about $1 trillion to $2 trillion, and that's about $200 billion per year to launch the Green New Deal. Now, the other lesson, the one I've been emphasizing all through all this, is that spending alone will not decarbonize the economy. We can't just say public investments, let's commit to spending $1 to $2 trillion on green things and just walk away. We have to tackle those major market disincentives. We need complementary pricing reforms to transition to green energy, such as phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and taxing carbon. We also need these reforms because they will produce the incentives for long-term investments in low carbon energy and for reducing dependence on fossil fuels. They will also pay for the costs of much of the investments, if not all of it, for a 5-year Green New Deal. So how do we pay for this Green New Deal? Well, first of all, let's do what we promised to do 10 years ago and get rid of all the fossil fuel and producer subsidies. For example, just for coal, they cost us $9 billion a year. There are many other subsidies for other types of fossil fuels. And we could use those subsidies immediately to help support to cover public support for private clean energy R&D. So we could quickly swap our subsidies from fossil fuels to supporting that private R&D through public investments, those technology push policies I talked about. A tax on carbon, like $65 per metric ton, that could generate at least $240 billion per year in revenues. And these revenues alone would cover that bill I talked about for a 5-year Green New Deal, the down payment on a Green New Deal. And in fact, we'd have more money, which we could use for raising the minimum wage, providing payments for retraining or displaced workers, reducing burdens on vulnerable households that might be adversely affected by the carbon tax, paying dividends, universal basic income schemes in certain cities, and so forth. And we are worried, of course, about a carbon tax being distorting, but the International Monetary Fund said that even if you had a $75 carbon tax, yes, something like gasoline prices would go up, but the rise in prices would be less than how much gasoline prices have fallen during the pandemic. We have seen a greater fall in the price of gasolines. They're at historical lows, decadal lows, I should say, due to the pandemic. A $75 tax would raise them only partially back to pre-COVID levels. A $65 tax would do that even less. So we can afford to pay for it, and we can use some of the money to help those households that are particularly adversely affected. Other countries have implemented carbon taxes, so this is not a revolutionary policy, and they've had different revenues. I have to admit that some of the countries have looked like they have impressive carbon taxes, but in actual fact, there's a lot of exceptions, exemptions, and so forth, so the amount of revenues they actually raise turns out to be smaller. What's important is that in order to meet our agreements under the Paris Climate Agreement, or any country, the World Bank estimates we should have all countries should have carbon taxes between $40 and $80 per metric ton. A $65 carbon tax for the US would fit right in. Right now, our carbon tax is zero. So any kind of carbon tax, $20, $40, or $65 would be significant and an important change in market disincentives. There's some other important other important benefits. That expenditures that are targeted at clean energy research and development would, of course, have these spillover effects. It would lower costs economy-wide and increase wider adoption of the technology. And that's the spillover effect. We've seen that happen already to some degree in a limited way in the case of the rapid fall in solar panel costs. Essentially, this is what's happened with solar panels. However, we would be better served if we could also see the same thing happen with, let's say, battery storage or development of new types of batteries and use of and for electricity generation and so forth. The other kind of positive effect that can happen is called the chicken and egg effect. If you increase demand for a new type of product, then it leads for innovations that would also lower the cost. So for example, if people start purchasing electrical vehicles, that'll stimulate demand for charging stations. And we're starting to see that already. If the government comes in and starts supporting the development of a charging station network nationwide, then there'll be more reason for people to buy electrical vehicles. And again, that will lead to more demand for charging stations, and the whole thing starts to reinforce itself, and the price, more cars will be produced, the price will fall, and suddenly electric cars are incredibly affordable. And then, of course, the carbon tax, it will raise some revenues, but keep in mind the main purpose of the carbon tax is to help reduce emissions. And the drop can be quite significant. And if it does that, then yes, it will be less revenues, but it'll also reduce the price tag of the Green New Deal, particularly in the later stages after the first 5 years. Okay, so essentially, a comprehensive approach, what I'm trying to say here, and I'll end with this, is that we really need think about a Green New Deal as a long-term three-part policy strategy. Step one is we phase out environmentally harmful subsidies, particularly with respect to fossil fuels. Second, implement market-based incentives, carbon taxes, but also other incentives for pollution and resource use. And use those financial savings and revenues to support green innovation. That's the three-part strategy. And that's perfectly feasible for both North America and for globally. So I'm going to skip through this and just basically show you the three steps. Step one, phase out environmentally harmful subsidies, rationalize and phase out the environmentally motivated subsidies because we won't need them so much anymore. We can expand and implement more effective market-based incentives to green our economy, to change those market disincentives that work against it. And the money raised from these initiatives will help us pay for those necessary public support and those private and the public support, both in terms of for green R&D investments and also for public infrastructure green investments that I talked about earlier. So my final remarks are this. I get back to the question that I raised early on. What do we want here? Do we want green sectors to remain a niche as part of an overall brown economy, or do we want them to foster economy-wide innovation and prosperity? Do we want a highly subsidized economy or a green one? That three-step strategy I've outlined to you and some of the policies I've highlighted, they're aiming to enhance economy-wide green structural transformation and innovation. That's how things are done in our economy. That's how we get the big booms. That's how we got the Industrial Revolution. And that's how we got the information revolution that we've had recently. All three policy steps are essential to an integrated green transition strategy. Green New Deal is the fulcrum for doing this. And that is exactly what we need to think about the Green New Deal, a 5 to 10 year plan to complement it with this type of strategy to focus our economy in the right direction and be the takeoff towards a green transformation. Right now, we're in danger of just focusing on a recovery and doing nothing, but there's a cost of doing nothing. Unlike my young friend in this cartoon, I think the time for action is here. We're at a critical crossroads. There are some green sectors. There's some green life. There's popular support for something big and transformative in our society. We need to do something, not do nothing. Of course, there is a strong popular movement behind the Green New Deal. I've outlined an economic way of doing it. There's others who have also highlighted economic ways of doing this that could work. Biggest obstacle remains political. It's not economic, it's not social. Politics is the problem, and we need to address that if that's what we want to do. So thanks very much, everyone. Many of the recent statistics and analysis I've put in this is available in a technical paper. Or I should say a policy paper. It's not that technical, that I wrote recently for the UN Environment Program, where they asked me to revisit the lessons learned from the Great Recession for a post-COVID green economy recovery. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Barbier. Since I'm here to address politics, which Dr. Barbier says is the main challenge, I'm going to take the route that many politicians take and try to have my cake and eat it too, which is to say I'm going to question whether Dr. Barbier goes too far and then also question whether he doesn't go far enough. So central to the Green New Deal is the decarbonization of the economy, and central to that goal are pricing reforms, aka a carbon tax. And the question is a carbon tax too blunt an instrument, and should we try to gently nudge rather than strike with a hammer in this, our polarized economy? So Biden never mentions a carbon tax on his website on environmental and climate change. Indeed, he stays clear of the T word altogether, except to say he'll reverse the Trump tax breaks for the rich. But in the final debate, we saw Biden propose the ending of subsidies and eventually the phasing out of fossil fuels, though it looked like he was trying to walk that back, at least in terms of its timeline in the days that followed, out of fear of repercussions in some swing states. And it's not just fossil fuel companies that will resist. We saw in 2018 in France when President Macron tried to propose higher fuel taxes, that the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, had a strong reaction to that. Some of them carrying signs that the government cares about the end of the world, we care about the end of the month. You know, personally, I don't think that carbon tax is too blunt of an instrument at all, but I think it has to be grounded in a broader revision of the tax code so that it doesn't punish the economically challenged segments of society and that it stimulates innovators. There's lots of ways to do that, and Dr. Barbier, I'm sure, is familiar with them all and has addressed some of them, though he didn't get a chance to talk about that with us tonight. Beyond integrating carbon tax within the broader transformation of economic stimuli and redistributive policies, this is where I'm going to have the cake part. Carbon taxes may be, in fact, too limited. Maybe it's just one of many blunt instruments that we need to employ to ensure a more livable planet. Carbon tax is really an extension in an age of climate change of the polluter pays principle. But there's another principle which isn't addressed, which is the depleter pays principle. This looks not at pollution, but at the depletion of non-renewable resources, including biodiversity. And some, but not all forms of depletion have a carbon footprint. So it seems to me that the pollution pays principle of a carbon tax needs to be complemented with other blunt instruments like the depleter pays principle, which looks at the preservation of things that otherwise would be depleted and often quickly depleted in a capitalist economy. With both polluter pays and depleter pays principles put into policies, we'd be getting near to something which is sometimes called full cost pricing or full cost accounting. And that would reward sustainable design, which is sometimes called cradle to cradle design or design for environment or eco design. But basically the idea is those products or services that are used have to be non-toxic with no negative effects on the environment, can be used in continuous cycles. Biological components have to be organic and sustainably sourced. All waste has to become food. That is to say, we've got to get to the way nature operates, where there's no waste at all, waste that is wasted. These life cycle assessments are done to evaluate all the environmental and social impacts of what we do in the economy. If a carbon tax were introduced in the context of that broader program, then we could have, I think, what Dr. Barbier calls a market-based green transformation. But it would be a transformation that requires more than just a carbon tax. There is the danger here of the best becoming the enemy of the good, that if you try to do too much, you won't get anything done. And that could certainly be the case in many countries, including a country like the United States, where many of these things face an uphill climb. So that's a real danger. But this gets us to the problem of whether we're out to tweak capitalism or transform it, I think, and whether we need to consider moving from a growth-based economy to what many decades ago Herman Daly called a steady state economy, which isn't grounded on endless and accelerating growth. Although it's possible we could have that sort of growth with technological innovation these days in a way which is both carbon neutral and in a way which also doesn't deplete non-renewable resources like biodiversity, though that's an even steeper uphill climb. I want to leave some time for people to ask questions, so I'll leave it with something that Naomi Klein wrote in her book On Fire, The Burning Case for a Green New Deal. She notes that the co-founder of the Heartland Institute, Joseph Bast, said that climate change is perfect for the left because it allows them to do everything they wanted to do anyway. Klein looks at this and says, while the Heartlanders react to evidence of human-induced climate change as if capitalism itself were coming under threat, it's not because they're paranoid, it's because they're paying attention. So I guess the broader question here is capitalism under threat with a program like the Green New Deal? And should that be a cause of concern or celebration? I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Barbier and Professor Thiel. We have questions beginning to line up in the queue, but maybe just to start off, I'll let Professor Barbier just have a few minutes to respond to Professor Thiel's response, and then we'll probably be able to start off with questions subsequent to that.
Thanks very much, Les. Excellent comments, which I enjoyed greatly, and which I actually agree with. It's quite interesting is that when I give talks within the Beltway, that's the Beltway around Washington, D.C., I'm told that raising the T word, as you pointed out, Joe Biden has failed to do, is you're dead in the water every time you do it. When I'm outside the Beltway, the message you hear from the heartland, from farmers that are affected by flooding and drought, wildfires in Colorado, one that's burning 5 miles from where I'm sitting right now, and another one that's burning was burning closer to another place where I used to live in Wyoming, where many of my friends have had to evacuate. People are concerned that we're not taking global environmental risks seriously, and particularly climate change. And they're actually saying, yes, do what we need to do to take care of climate change. It's clear that much of the Green New Deal that's talked about ends up talking about climate-friendly policies and carbon mainly, and clean energy as the solution to everything. When I write about it, I talk about green structural transformation as changing the fundamental nature of the economy from one that uses all types of natural resources and creates pollution, making it less. And so most of my work, in fact, some of the slides I deleted, I skipped over just because of time, focuses on other types of policies as well, other types of taxes. But if I want to have one takeaway message for people to have from here, is think very carefully about what our economy looks like today, and what are the real constraints on us making this transformation to a green economy, to a greener economy. And I think you'll see these very powerful market disincentives that I'm talking about, our underinvestment in green innovation and our underpricing of fossil fuels and other industries, sectors that have environmental bads. And there's both, those underpricing takes place, both subsidies as well as damages that are not included in the price, which can only be corrected through market-based incentives. And I'm also very much worried when I talk to financial people as well as policymakers today, is that the biggest consequence of the post-COVID situation, once we finally stop dealing with the pandemic, the health and economic costs, is that we're going to have a huge deficit, and we're going to have huge debt, but particularly a deficit. The fiscal space to just spend money and keep spending is not going to be possible. So we do have to think about raising the money in a way that can also benefit the green structural transformation, and also raise money to help us do those complementary public investments that we sorely need. And so the strategy I'm talking about is that way. I've been talking actually about it for the last 10 or so years. As I pointed out, it's starting to filter through. People are starting to get it. As Les pointed out, in the Biden plan, the $1 to $2 trillion of spending is there. I'm not convinced it's completely the right mix, but it's on the right lines. But the issue of how do we pay for that as we move forward is not addressed. And particularly if we don't start talking about addressing the pricing problem in our economy, we're not going to make that leap. At the end of the day, our economy is one where private individuals, both consumers, producers, and investors, respond to market signals. And those market signals are incredibly important for determining the pattern of investment, innovation, and ultimately the structure of our economy moving forward. And we want it to get greener. There's no question.
We have a question from Nicole Pantoja, and it concerns the all-important question of money. You know, how to pay. How is it that we're going to affect this green transformation? She asks, in regards to affordability, could we cut funds from other departments like the military that receive a lot of funding? From my understanding, the military receives a lot of unnecessary funds and even receives higher funds than healthcare.
That's definitely true. The question really is, to what extent can you cut the military budget, and how does it affect national security? The thing that's really interesting here is that military spending is assumed to be necessary for national security. I'm making the case that a Green New Deal and spending on this policy is essential for economic security, not just environmental security. I think one of the biggest limitations that we have to get through here is to think about the Green New Deal as being just about the environment. It's not. It's about justice, equality, inclusivity, economic prosperity, innovation, and development. And for too long, we're stuck. The economy we have today is based on a structure that was set both before World War II and just afterwards. I wrote a book up looking at this for some time ago, and we are moving into an era where we can't afford that anymore, and we need to make the transition. But what stopped it is that we are basically spending, yes, lots of money on military protection, national security. I think we can reallocate some from that for the Green New Deal, but I think that we can pay for the Green New Deal, or at least what I think is a down payment on that green transformation, which is what I call a Green New Deal, by doing the things that we need to do anyway, which is, again, addressing these market disincentives. We are wasting so much money in our economy on the wrong things, on subsidizing the old way and the ancient way. There's another thing that matters here, which I haven't mentioned, but I do in many of my books and the report I just mentioned, which is that the United States isn't in a vacuum. There's about 8 or 10 economies in the world that are on the verge of making a transition, or they could potentially make the transition to be the next world leader in terms of green innovation and investments globally as well as within their countries. And this green race for international competitiveness and for the next leadership of the world economy, which is going to be green, it's just a question of when and how. This competition is getting hotter. And right now, it's Asian countries that are taking the lead. China, South Korea, to some extent Japan, we're falling behind. In Europe, it's Germany that's moving ahead. And we are lagging behind. And this is the first time in recent history that the US has failed to lead in world innovation. And it's a little bit worrisome for the future that we are not thinking about green innovation and green investments as a strategy for industrial success, economic success, and prosperity. And of course, with that, rising productivity, better wages, and better prosperity and inclusivity for all of our citizens.
Les, do you care to add anything to this question?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of words. One is, I think Dr. Barbier does a good job of pointing out how COVID provides us an opportunity to rethink some global challenges, the challenge of climate change. I think it also provides an opportunity to rethink the role of the military and international cooperation. You know, the pandemic has really demonstrated how we're not going to be able to treat the next pandemic the way we treated this one, in a very isolated fashion. Likewise, in military affairs, international cooperation is going to have to be much more at the forefront. You know, military strategists say the mistake most generals make is to try to refight the last battle when the new battle is going to be a different one. You know, cybersecurity is all at the fore of military threats right now. And that doesn't look like the sort of threat that the United States has been using a lot of its military budgets to gird its loins against over the last decades. And so I think there's an opportunity in the face of cyber threats and in the face of the need for increased international cooperation to do things differently and to spend that money differently than we have in the past.
Thank you very much. There's another question now from Bryce Wolken. I'll transition to this. His question is, with the United States spending deficit nearing our GDP, the Green New Deal will likely result in spending surpassing our yearly GDP, a sign of hyperinflation. Do you think there is a way to maintain the Green New Deal without resulting in spending surpassing GDP? And if so, how?
Yeah, well, I think so. I mean, I think the questioner is right that some people who have looked at the original Green New Deal resolution, which called for 100% renewable energy in 10 years, have made the calculations and said that the amount of money to do that would be equivalent to the entire GDP of the United States. But I've been arguing, as I pointed out, that I think a more realistic budget for the Green New Deal is one that's $1 to $2 trillion over the next 5 to 10 years. That's still a lot of money. I mean, we've spent more than that this year to fight the pandemic. And our deficit, as I pointed out, has gone from 1 trillion. This is the budget deficit for the government. It's gone from 1 trillion to 3 trillion. So the more we're spending to fight the pandemic, and we keep doing it, the bigger our deficit's going to get, the bigger our overall debt's going to get. And then there's less fiscal space or room to maneuver to spend more additional money on the Green New Deal. Hence my suggestion that, yes, we do need $1 to $2 trillion to spend on a Green New Deal over the next 5 to 10 years, but we can pay for that through removing perverse environmental subsidies for fossil fuels and other areas and reallocating it for some of the expenditures, and through things like a carbon tax and any other market-based incentives to control environmental bads. Those revenues can be used, and that way we can afford to do it. But as long as we get into this zero-sum game that we're seeing in politics right now, where it's like, yes, we want to do this, but we're not going to pay for it. We're not going to talk about how do we pay for it. We're just going to assume that the money will be there, and we can keep on spending, keep increasing public spending and debt. That's starting to worry some people, not just economists, but policymakers in the United States and elsewhere. So I think but we can turn them around, and that's actually an opportunity where people can stop treating the T word as if it's a 4-letter word, even though it's 3 letters.
Yes. Les, this is going in a more economic direction, but would you care to weigh in on this also? Or?
Just a short word. I mean, I think deficits are a real concern, and belt tightening is going to be required. But I think COVID again has demonstrated that you can pay now or pay later. With COVID, we've paid later because we didn't do the preparation that would be necessary. And I think the same, even more so, for forces for climate change. You either pay now or down the road, the bills are going to be astronomical, and not just measured in dollars and cents, but in human lives and suffering as well.
I'd actually, at this point, thank you very much, Les. I'd like to slip in a question of my own with respect to the global Green New Deal as it went forward back in 2008, 2009, with the subsidies, with the plan, and clearly this was a kind of endeavor. It was global, but yet it was involving multiple different countries in places with different political realities. It wasn't a sort of uniform thing everywhere. It was very sort of continent specific, country specific, et cetera. So a lot of other variables undoubtedly were coming into play there. Was there any sign, I'm curious, was there any sign that any one of the countries or group of the countries were actually able to move much more sort of in this direction of creating this kind of transformation that was the goal for everybody? You mentioned Asian countries now being sort of ahead in a race. Would that be another way of saying that Asian countries were the ones also who were able to sort of gather the most momentum from the Green New Deal back in the time of the Great Recession, and actually carry that further and do more with it?
The short answer is yes, but not completely.
Okay.
So interesting enough, during that 2008-10 period, in 2009, South Korea launched what their stimulus package wasn't really a stimulus package. It was part of their 5-year plan, and it was called the the Korean Green New Deal. That's what they called it themselves, because it was an attempt to try and come up with 5 years of spending at 1% of GDP, and the aim was to do transformation. But there were two things they didn't do, and a third thing they have eventually done, which is a good thing. The two things they didn't do was they didn't follow up, first of all, with any kind of change to of their market structure, their market incentives. So the Koreans failed to adopt a carbon tax or tradable permits for carbon or any other market incentive to complement their Green New Deal. Second thing they didn't do was they didn't carry through with the plans, and in fact they spent a lot of the money on water infrastructure projects rather than on the green industrial development. However, one of the things they did do, which was positive, and this is something they started under the Green New Deal, and then they carried on and they've continued on to this day. If you remember that chart I showed you about how environmental innovations per capita are really high in South Korea and still sustained, well, there's a huge set of programs in Korea that is supporting public support for private R&D, and this is starting to have an impact on some of their key industries because their aim is to rival China with regard to particularly green technologies in existing industries, green technologies existing in industries, as well as low emission vehicles, electric cars, the car industry, because of course South Korea has a very powerful car industry globally and growing one. So they have focused a lot on green R&D. So there's a lesson there to be learned. But without they have adopted a tradable permit policy, but it's very weak, and it doesn't really put a sufficient price on carbon through tradable permits to make it effective. So they're kind of a hybrid here. They've done some things, but not others. They haven't really carried through. But I can believe you that both the Koreans and the Chinese still think in 5 to 10 years of planning, and they are pushing more and more towards green because they see it as an industrial strategy first, an economic strategy, and then also they see fossil fuels as being old technology, and they want to move away from it, even though in the Chinese case, they are heavily dependent on their coal industry still for electricity generation.
So speaking from a sort of the humanities perspective, where imagining plays a role that probably one cannot afford to play so much in the fields of economics and political science, but imagining what needs to happen, politically, concretely, and I know that's going to differ from place to place, and in a way we've been talking about all of this, but is it? I've heard different things. I've heard monies being available for developing green infrastructures, which kind of sounds like a top-down way of starting to make things green. Where might there be other possibilities? I mean, just thinking again, here I am, the humanist, thinking imaginatively and seeing the obstacles sort of we're coming up against and wondering, how is it that we go to this place, which seems immensely doable? I mean, it seems like once the assumptions are accepted, that this greening process, that becoming more sustainable, is something that is quite achievable. How is it? Where, what's the approach politically that can be taken, if any? That would be one thing I would ask, and the other is, I mean, I can see sort of the top-down sort of dynamics or logic of a lot of the sorts of things that subsidies and things like that would put into place. How do we cultivate maybe more at a ground level or a grassroots kind of level, something that might significantly change the game? Now, I realize that's not necessarily something that you're concentrated on, but maybe it is. But more grassroots more, I don't know if like feeding money for different kinds of ideas that might develop at a grassroots level, something along these lines?
Yes, that's an excellent question. Well, first of all, I think there's room for two approaches here. Again, what's happened with COVID is really important here. We know what the consequences are not having a national strategy for dealing with the pandemic. Locally and certainly statewide, the response to COVID has been amazing in this country. I mean, certainly in my state, Colorado, and I'm sure in others, New York, it's amazing mobilization. I mean, the governor of Maryland, a Republican, basically went out without support and made a deal with Korea to bring PPE in because he desperately needed it. So the local and grassroots and the state level response is true. And we're seeing that with green movements. I mean, look what California is doing, Colorado is doing, Vermont. All these states are doing this at that level. And you look at cities and communities within it, you see tremendous things. And that's really important. But we still need a national policy and strategy, just like we've seen the consequences for this country dealing with the pandemic without a response. We have to understand that greening an economy is not just something that's done locally, but it needs support from the national level with coherent policies, coordination between national level responses, state level responses, and local responses. And they need to work together and in concert. And that's really important if we're going to do this. This is not a small thing. And I think what Les said is really, really important, is that I think policymakers have to get two messages across to people right now. First of all, if we don't pay for a Green New Deal now or for this transformation, we're going to pay for it later in a big way. And we're starting to pay for it now with floods and fires and everything and droughts and so forth. So we need to be real about this. And the second thing is the point that I've been making. Policymakers have got to stop talking about this as a climate issue or an environmental issue. It's an economic issue. It is not just an environmental strategy. We can't separate environmental from economic, and it's a justice issue. We've just recently stopped talking about justice and inequality and the environment as separate things. We now talk about environmental justice. And of course, the slides I put it up, the people who are causing most of the problem are the wealthy. The people who are affected most by the consequences are the poor and the vulnerable. And we have to, if we want to address inequality in our economy, we have to realize that these environmental costs are unequally distributed.
Les, would you like to add to that? Oh, I think we have you on mute.
Sorry, just to pick up on your addressing the issue from a humanist perspective, and Dr. Barbier's issue of how we look at this thing. I mean, I think the question of how you frame the debate is crucial. What the terminology that is used is crucial, and what the narrative is that under which these policies are constructed is crucial. We live in a country where it's not only tax, it's a dirty word. Liberal is a dirty word. That's an amazing transformation from the way this country, was birthed. And that was achieved through political means. And so I think humanists focusing on how this is looked at, whether it's a climate problem or a broader economic problem, and what the narrative is that allows for the transformation of the terminology and how the debate gets framed is going to be really crucial to being able to move forward with a Green New Deal or anything that's going to be able to address some of these huge challenges we face.
So thank you. I think on that note, that's a good place for us to call it a night. And I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Barbier, for being willing to talk to us here at UF. We knew we wanted to do something this fall, despite everything that's going on and despite all of the challenges and our preference certainly would have been to bring you in person, but at least we can have you come and participate in a webinar such as this. And I think things worked very nicely. And thanks again, Les, for your help with this, as in the past, and for your support. That this basically has been our third of 4 webinars. I'd ask you please not to forget the final webinar of the symposium, which will take place on this coming Thursday with anthropologist Frances Roberts Gregory, and with a response from Professor Rachel Grant of UF's College of Journalism. I mentioned, oh, by the way, the very interesting title of Robert Gregory's talk is Resist, Recover, and Reimagine Black and Indigenous Women for Climate Justice in Gulf Coast, Louisiana. She's currently in New Orleans, so let's wish her the best. Zeta goes elsewhere and doesn't harm anybody. But these are the times we live in. But with that, I again thank the speakers. I thank you all, participants, for coming, and please don't forget the talk day after tomorrow.